honking and screaming outside, and I was like, what the hell? And intercom, and his Grace, Dolph, darling, I'm here.
She set his clothes on fire after a fight. He stayed even when she brought home partners for chaotic nights that blurred every boundary. In 1983, Grace Jones spotted a bouncer in a Sydney nightclub who was about to begin a PhD at MIT and hired him on the spot as her bodyguard. Within months, the unknown Swedish engineer was stepping into Hollywood's spotlight. Dolph Lundgren gave up his scholarship, his father's expectations, and his future plan to follow her into a world of Studio 54, Andy Warhol's factory, and endless neon nights. They posed for bold, provocative photo shoots that challenged every norm of race, power, and beauty in the 1980s.
Yeah, I'd been with Grace for about 2-3 years.
Who was as big as it gets?
Grace was huge.
They partied with Bowie and Michael Jackson. She used her connections to land him his first screen job, the break that opened the door to Rocky IV. He went from arm candy to action star. But when you burn that bright, how long can it actually last? This is the story of fashion's most explosive romance, and why it was always heading toward one ending. Sydney, 1983. Grace Jones walked into King's Cross like she owned it, which in a way she did. The Jamaican-born supermodel had already conquered Paris runways for Yves Saint Laurent and Kenzo, transformed herself into an avant-garde music icon with albums like Warm Leatherette, and turned androgyny into high art. Her shaved head, angular cheekbones, and powerful presence made her impossible to ignore. She was in Australia promoting her latest album when she spotted something unusual at a nightclub, a 6'5" Swedish bouncer who moved with the controlled precision of a martial artist. Dolph Lundgren, still going by Hans at the time, was 26 years old and living a completely different life. The former European karate champion holds a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Sydney. A Fulbright scholarship to MIT sat waiting for him, promising a future in academia.
Funny thing is, I was a chemical engineering student.
Right, MIT.
MIT. So my dad thought I was going to MIT, and
He was working nightclub security to pay the bills, a temporary gig before starting his PhD. The intersection of these two worlds should have been impossible. A bouncer checking IDs at the door, a superstar who'd already graced Vogue covers and recorded with the best producers in the business. Grace saw something others missed. Maybe it was his silence that intrigued her. In a world of people desperate for her attention, here was someone who simply did his job. Or perhaps she recognized the discipline it took to become a European karate champion, the same focus she'd used to transform herself from Kingston tomboy to Paris sensation. That first night turned into conversation, then celebration. By morning, she'd hired him as her bodyguard for the rest of her tour. The connection was immediate. Jones has said she brought him in as protection and, very quickly, as a lover. He has said that meeting her blew up the path he thought he was on. She wasn't interested in him as just hired muscle. She moved him from the door to her side and folded him into her life at high speed. Within months, his life had completely shifted. The MIT scholarship gathered dust. The engineering textbooks stayed closed. Instead, he found himself on planes to Paris, to New York, to places he'd only read about. Grace didn't just hire him. She absorbed him into her world with the same intensity she brought to everything. Friends noticed how she looked at him, not as an employee, not even as a typical boyfriend, but as raw material she could shape into something extraordinary. The move to New York in late 1983 felt less like relocation and more like entering another dimension. Grace's apartment became Dolph's new reality, a space where fashion designers dropped by at midnight, where music played constantly, and where the rules of conventional life simply didn't apply. She introduced him to her world methodically, almost scientifically, the way a conductor might bring in a new instrument. Warhol quickly became part of their orbit, photographing them often, at the factory, at parties, anywhere he spotted them together. During one shoot, he asked Dolph his famous question, "What are you famous for?" The answer was still nothing, but Grace was already changing that. She brought him to fashion sets, first as part of her entourage, then as someone worth shooting on his own. Photographers like Jean-Paul Goude and Peter Beard started paying attention. His quietness, which could have seemed shy, came across instead as deliberate and magnetic, The transformation picked up speed. He dropped Hans and started going by Dolph, a family nickname that looked clean on magazine pages. Fashion circles moved in quickly. Gianni Versace even designed him a custom leather jacket before the name Versace became global shorthand for luxury. Grace coached him relentlessly: how to enter a room, how to hold himself in front of cameras, how to let silence read as power. What started as attraction quickly turned into transformation. She was sculpting him into the image she saw before anyone else did.
I was faithful to Grace, and we were in love, so I didn't mess around. But
And she didn't limit that to looks. She plugged him straight into downtown culture that blurred art, nightlife, and provocation. He was suddenly at Warhol's factory, suddenly in rooms with Keith Haring and Iman, suddenly face-to-face with people who defined 80s New York as it was being invented. He didn't just watch Grace Jones turn daily life into spectacle. She showed him how to move through the world like it was her stage. Lundgren would later say that, thanks to her, he found himself hanging out with Andy Warhol, David Bowie, and Michael Jackson as if that were normal. Their days followed no pattern except intensity. They might sleep until afternoon, then spend hours at the gym, Grace maintaining her dancer's physique, Dolph pushing his karate-trained body to new extremes. Evenings meant cocktails with the fashion crowd, then clubs until dawn. The Limelight area, Danceteria, each night a different venue, but always the same cast of creative outliers who defined downtown Manhattan culture. Friends from this period describe watching Dolph change week by week. His posture shifted from protective bodyguard to equal partner. His wardrobe evolved from basic black to designer pieces that complemented Grace's avant-garde choices. Most significantly, his presence grew. The quiet bouncer from Sydney was becoming someone who belonged in these rooms, who could hold his own among some of the most dynamic personalities of the era. By 1984, Grace and Dolph had become the couple everyone wanted at their party. Their lifestyle represented everything excessive and extraordinary about pre-AIDS Manhattan, a time when pleasure had no apparent consequences and boundaries existed only to be crossed. Their apartment became legendary for gatherings that started as dinner parties and evolved into something else entirely. The stories from this period read like fiction, except they weren't. Dolph would later admit in interviews that Grace would sometimes bring home as many as 5 girls after nights out, and that keeping up with her appetites, sexual, creative, chemical, was exhausting. These weren't hidden encounters, but part of their public persona, their commitment to experiencing everything without limits. The apartment's revolving door welcomed artists, models, musicians, and anyone else who caught their interest. Their public appearances became performance art. Grace might arrive at a gallery opening in a hood and cape, only to reveal a metal breastplate underneath. Dolph would stand beside her in perfectly tailored suits that emphasized his physique, playing the silent protector while she commanded the room. Photographers couldn't resist them. The visual power of their pairing, her sharp angles against his classical proportions, her dark skin against his Nordic paleness, created instant art. But that level of heat came with blast radius. The arguments were just as operatic as the fun. Dolph has talked about jealous confrontations, and Grace herself wrote that during one fight she literally set his trousers on fire. He's also described her showing up with a gun when she felt he was pulling away. These weren't PR stunts. This was their real private life leaking into legend. The drugs, the alcohol, the constant motion. It was unsustainable, and somewhere they must have known it. But knowing and stopping are different things. Grace's career demanded constant reinvention, constant energy. She was recording, touring, acting. Dolph was trying to establish himself, taking acting classes with Warren Robertson, going to auditions, trying to convert his new visibility into something concrete. Keith Haring often sketched them at downtown gatherings, capturing their energy in quick electric lines. Jean-Michel Basquiat would trade opinions with Grace about art and music, while Dolph quietly observed, taking everything in. A young Madonna, still fighting for her big break, could sometimes be seen dancing nearby, studying the composure Grace carried into every room. These weren't just parties. They were the kind of nights that would later feel larger than life, moments that blurred the line between fame, art, and legend. Yet even within the chaos, there was discipline. Grace stayed meticulous about her music, often spending long hours in the studio shaping what would become Slave to the Rhythm. Dolph kept his own structure, maintaining his martial arts and weight training routine, sometimes heading to the gym after barely sleeping. Both kept pushing forward, she refining her art, he preparing for the acting breakthrough that was just ahead, even as the pace and excess of their world threatened to consume them. Grace understood fame as architecture, something you built deliberately, piece by piece. With Dolph, she became an architect of transformation. Every introduction she made, every door she opened was calculated to position him for success. Her approach didn't come from control, but from collaboration. She saw his potential and used every resource at her disposal to realize it. The modeling came first. Grace leveraged her relationships with photographers and magazines to get Dolph in front of cameras. Not as a traditional model, he was, as agencies told him, too tall and muscular for runway work, but as a presence, a figure who could embody a certain kind of masculine power that was coming into fashion. The shoots were often with Grace, their chemistry translating into images that felt dangerous and electric. Film was the bigger goal. Grace had already crossed into movies, playing Zula in Conan the Destroyer and landing the role of Mayday in the upcoming James Bond film A View to a Kill. She knew Hollywood was where Dolph's physicality could turn into real stardom. When the Bond producers began casting, she didn't just suggest him, she insisted they take a look. He ended up getting a small part as a KGB operative named Vince. The role was tiny, just a few scenes and almost no dialogue, but it was still a James Bond film. The production took them to London, where Dolph got to observe how big-budget movies worked from the inside. More importantly, it put him in front of casting directors who suddenly had a face to remember. Grace made sure of that, bringing him everywhere that mattered: premieres, fashion events, industry parties, places where a connection could change a career. She pushed him just as hard creatively. When friends at his acting studio mentioned that Sylvester Stallone was casting for Rocky IV, looking for a Soviet boxer, Grace didn't just tell him to try, she helped him shape his approach. Together, they prepared photos that highlighted his martial arts background and European look, and she drilled him on presence, how to communicate power without saying a word. The audition process stretched for months. Stallone reportedly met hundreds of candidates before narrowing the search. Dolph sent photos, then tapes, and eventually flew to Los Angeles for meetings. During that entire stretch, Grace kept him grounded and focused. When the role of Ivan Drago finally became his, it was his achievement. But Grace's handprints were everywhere in the story that got him there. Their public image during this time was deliberately constructed. They showed up at Paris Fashion Week in coordinated looks that inverted expectations. Grace in tailored suits, Dolph in looser, fluid silhouettes. At art openings and premieres, their presence alone was enough to draw photographers. Every outing reinforced what they had built together, a mythic pairing that didn't fit into any ordinary category. Late November 1985, Rocky IV premiered in Los Angeles. Dolph arrived as Grace Jones's boyfriend, another striking +1 at another high-profile event. The photographers knew Grace, wanted Grace, positioned their flashes for her. Dolph stood beside her in a tux, quietly playing the role of the beautiful accessory to genuine fame. Then the lights dimmed. For the next 90 minutes, audiences watched him become Ivan Drago, the silent, towering Soviet who ends Apollo Creed's life in the ring. His presence, already magnetic, turned monumental on screen. That single line, "I must break you," delivered with mechanical calm, instantly entered pop culture. When the credits rolled, the shift was unmistakable. The man who had entered as someone's companion walked out a movie star. The photographers who'd been focused on Grace suddenly pivoted to Dolph. The questions that had been for Grace were now for him. Studio executives who'd barely acknowledged him at the reception were suddenly very interested in conversation. Grace watched this shift with what friends described as a mixture of pride and something else. Perhaps the recognition that success has its own momentum. The film was a massive hit. Within weeks, Dolph was fielding offers for leading roles. He was no longer Grace Jones's boyfriend, but Dolph Lundgren, star of Rocky IV. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship mentor and student, star and discovery, suddenly felt unstable. Grace had created exactly what she'd intended, but creation has a way of exceeding creators' control. Their appearances together took on a different quality. At a fashion awards ceremony in Paris, photographers called for Dolph to step aside so they could shoot Grace alone, then asked Grace to step aside for solo shots of Dolph. The equivalence was new and uncomfortable. In interviews, journalists now asked Dolph about his career plans rather than treating him as Grace's accessory. Grace's own career was in a different rhythm. Slave to the Rhythm had just been released to widespread praise and strong international sales, though it defied radio trends. Her sound was still ahead of its time, conceptual, theatrical, unapologetically her. She remained a global icon, but now the spotlight was splitting. The success she had helped engineer was pushing them down separate paths. Behind closed doors, the strain showed. Dolph was traveling constantly, to Los Angeles for meetings, to Europe for promotional tours. Grace had her own commitments, but increasingly they were separate. The synchronized life they'd built in New York was fracturing. Friends noticed they were appearing at different parties, taking separate flights, occupying space differently than before. The same intensity that created their bond now threatened to destroy it. The fights escalated from dramatic to genuinely destructive. The burning clothes incident wasn't isolated. Furniture was broken, objects thrown, voices raised loud enough for neighbors to call building security. These weren't simple arguments, but collisions between two people used to absolute control, suddenly feeling it slip away. The life that had once felt revolutionary started to wear them down. Dolph would later describe this period candidly: the endless parties, the constant stream of partners, the non-stop performance of being Grace and Dolph. He was trying to build a career that demanded discipline and early call times. The late nights and neon chaos that once felt electric were now exhausting. Grace was facing her own pressures. The music industry wanted her more accessible. The film world kept slotting her as a side presence instead of a lead. Her uniqueness, which made her untouchable, also boxed her in. Watching Dolph's rapid rise in Hollywood must have been complicated. Part pride, part frustration at how quickly doors opened for him. Friends from that time said it felt like watching something brilliant dismantle itself. The couple who once moved as one were now tugging in opposite directions. Their apartment, once a gathering place for artists and designers, became a space filled with shouting matches and slammed doors. The creative alliance that had built both their legends was now a rivalry neither could control. But the feeling never disappeared. Their connection stayed fierce, which made the unraveling even harder. This love didn't fade quietly. It collapsed under its own weight. Grace's need for autonomy clashed with Dolph's growing desire for structure. His push to stand on his own collided with her instinct to stay part of his evolution. The excess around them didn't help. Neither has spoken in detail about drugs, but the era's cocktail of stimulants and indulgence was everywhere. What had started as fuel for art and energy became a fuse for volatility. The same chemistry that made them magnetic was now dangerously unstable. The breakup, when it finally solidified in early 1987, surprised the public but not their inner circle. There was no dramatic announcement, no tabloid-friendly final fight. They simply stopped appearing together, stopped being Grace and Dolph, and became separate entities again. Or rather, became new versions of themselves, forever changed by their 4 years together.
You know, you've had a few high-profile relationships with other people as well known as you. Yeah. And there was one I remember, you were with Dolph Lundgren for a while. Mm-hmm. And yet it didn't end that well.
Dolph threw himself into his Hollywood career. Masters of the Universe, The Punisher, a string of action films that established him as a reliable leading man in a specific genre. He dated quietly, eventually marrying Swedish jewelry designer Annette Kviberg in 1994, having 2 daughters, building the stable life that had been impossible with Grace. Yet in every interview, even decades later, he speaks of Grace with a mixture of awe and exhaustion, calling their time together transformative. Grace continued being Grace, uncompromising, inventive, and impossible to categorize. She kept releasing music, appeared in films, and maintained her standing as a global style icon whose influence still shapes fashion and pop culture. She later entered a long-term relationship and, in 1996, married her former bodyguard Attila Altanbay, though the marriage eventually ended quietly. Nothing afterward carried the same public intensity as her years with Dolph. In her memoir, she writes about him with her usual directness, describing their time together as both creatively electric and ultimately unsustainable, a union too charged to survive. The cultural impact of their romance extended far beyond their personal story. They'd created a template for celebrity relationships that was simultaneously public and private, performed and authentic. Fashion designers still reference their visual power, the contrast, the coordination, the sheer audacity of their presentation. Musicians cite Grace's fearlessness during this period as inspiration. Film historians note how Dolph's emergence represented a new kind of action hero, one with art world credentials. Their relationship also captured something essential about the 1980s. The last moment before AIDS changed everything, before celebrity culture became totally managed, before social media made every private moment potentially public. They lived at maximum volume during a brief window when that was still possible, when you could disappear into a nightclub at midnight and emerge transformed at dawn. Looking back, friends and cultural observers often describe their romance as inevitable in both its formation and destruction. Two people with that much magnetism were bound to find each other and bound to ultimately repel. The very qualities that made them extraordinary together, the intensity, the ambition, the refusal to compromise, guaranteed they couldn't last. Grace Jones and Dolph Lundgren created something that transcended a simple love story. They built a 4-year performance piece that challenged every assumption about power, beauty, and possibility. She took a Swedish chemical engineer and turned him into an action star. He gave her a partner who could match her strength without trying to diminish it. Together, they embodied a moment when art and life were indistinguishable, when transformation was limited only by imagination. Their story remains fascinating because it was both absolutely of its time and somehow timeless. The specific circumstances, Studio 54, Andy Warhol, pre-AIDS Manhattan, can never be repeated. But the deeper narrative of two people using their connection to become entirely new versions of themselves resonates beyond any particular era. They showed what was possible when romance became art, when love meant not just accepting someone, but actively creating alongside them. Their story reminds us that the most memorable relationships aren't always the ones that last the longest. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that burn too hot to sustain themselves, leaving behind not just memories, but actual change in the world. Grace Jones and Dolph Lundgren changed each other, changed their industries, and changed what we thought was possible when two extraordinary people decided to build something together, even if that something was too powerful to last. The fact that it ended doesn't diminish what they achieved. Some relationships are meant to last forever. Others are meant to burn brilliantly and leave behind light that continues traveling through space long after the source has gone dark. Grace and Dolph created that kind of light, a flash so bright it illuminated an entire era, leaving after images that still shape how we understand fame, fashion, and the transformative power of human connection. Today, when we see a celebrity couple that seems to exist in their own universe, when we watch public figures use their relationship as a form of performance art, when we observe love becoming a creative force that transforms everyone it touches, we're seeing echoes of what Grace Jones and Dolph Lundgren invented in those wild years they shared. They didn't just have a romance. They created a new way for romance to exist in the public eye, turning their love into something that belonged to culture itself while remaining utterly their own.